Hey everyone, we're going to give it a moment or two for people to call on in and get onto the YouTube live channel before we get going. So thank you for being here, and we'll start in just a moment or two. Okay, so thank you everyone for joining for the second of the seminar series of Fish 513, Cultivating Inclusive Conservation Practices. Again, I'd really like to thank you all for tuning in, and I'd like to take the opportunity to thank the university, the School of Aquatic and Fishery Sciences, and also the Campus Sustainability Fund for making this seminar possible. If you're interested again in following along with any of the readings that we're doing for the class, they are posted on the course website, which I will make sure is in the video description below. And just a note again to folks, the closed captions won't be real time right now, but they will be added as of tomorrow. So it'll be a slight delay, but there will be closed captions. So again, I would like to start the seminar with a land acknowledgement, but I also wanted to add some information from my learning that I did last week. I said it was my goal to try and use Indigenous Peoples Day to learn more about the area in which I am living and the people whose land I'm living on. So I wanted to start off with the land acknowledgement of the University of Washington acknowledges the Coast Salish peoples of this land, the land which touches the shared waters of all tribes and bands within the Suquamish, Tulalip, and Muckleshoot nations. But I would also like to acknowledge that we are on the traditional lands of the Duwamish people, who are the first people of Seattle. So you remember last week, I challenged myself to learn and share more about the Native peoples of this area in which I live and work. And I found myself thinking on the importance of recognition, which is something that we'll talk more about today in today's seminar. And I wondered why the Duwamish people were not recognized in the UW land acknowledgement, especially as the city of Seattle is named after Chief Seattle, of which I use the anglicized pronunciation rather than the Lushootseed pronunciation. So that led me down the path of trying to understand the federal recognition process controlled by the Bureau of Indian Affairs. And as I read more about the procedures and the challenges that arise when tribes are seeking state and federal recognition, the varying requirements, and the burden of proof placed on applicants, and the lengthy and expensive petitioning process that often occurs, along with the denial of sovereignty and the resources that come with the refusal to federally recognize a tribe. For example, the Duwamish people did actually previously have federal recognition. They began petitioning in 1925, had a legal settlement where they were named the Duwamish tribe and recognized in 1971, and began the process for official recognition in 1978. In 2001, the Clinton administration officially recognized the Duwamish, but this was almost nearly immediately overturned in 2002 by the Bush administration. So this is all to say, appeals of this decision began again in 2015 and are still ongoing. And I think this feeds into the conversation that we're going to have today. This grueling petitioning process for recognition has really been forefront in my mind when thinking about collaborative conservation. And I plan to listen to the seminar today with the mindset of how recognition, power, and equity are the best ways to fight against erasure. With that, I will introduce our speaker for the day, Isabel Carrera Zamanillo. She is kind enough to come and share with us today. Isabel has over a decade of nonprofit and community organizing experience. She was born in Mexico, and Isabel has a professional background in biological and environmental sciences. She has worked and collaborated with a wide range of organizations and institutions in the development and management of science outreach programs and independent social justice projects. Isabel has worked in environmental justice related projects in Mexico and the United States, incorporating methods in ethnobiology and community-based participatory research. In 2012, Isabel relocated to the United States, and in 2017 completed a doctoral degree in environmental sciences at the School of Environmental and Forest Sciences at the University of Washington. Currently, she works at the University of Washington College of the Environment in the Office of Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion. And with that, I will welcome her and let you take it over, Isabel.
Thank you so much, Stacy. Hola, mucho gusto y muchas gracias por tenerme aquí. Hi, thank you so much for having me here, and it's so nice to meet you. I'm going to start sharing my screen, and the reason why I'm sharing my screen and not just the PowerPoint, you will see in a little bit. But what I want to talk to you today is about, yes, issues of power and privilege, but overall about how as individuals we have a positionality or a position in our different networks and what we can do. And today I'm going to focus this on the conservation field, which sometimes it's convoluted the way we talk in academia, because we assume that this is something academic, an academic discipline, when since time immemorial, different indigenous groups around the world have been doing what we call conservation. But let me start just giving you an idea of what I'm going to talk a little bit today with you, a little bit about me. We are going to discuss, I know it's hard in these new virtual environments, but a little bit what's nature. Then I'm going to talk about what's positionality for those who are unfamiliar with this term. What this plays in the current biodiversity crisis, especially in the settings of science and academia, and how in these settings there has been a legacy of colonialism and epistemic injustices. I'll make some examples to talk about the tensions between global North and South, since I come from what it's considered the global South, although Mexico, for Mexicans, it's part of North America. I'll talk a little bit more about the ivory tower, and I will offer some ideas of what can you do before we go into some questions and discussions. And please, Stacy, let me know if there are questions in the middle, because I cannot see questions in the chat. So a little bit about me. So Chilanga, that means I was born in Mexico City. Mexico City is in the center of Mexico. I come from a medium class family, so I can say I have privilege because I was able to attend school and go into higher education. Although consider that I went to the best university in Mexico in terms of sciences and in many other areas, which is Universidad Nacional Autónoma de México. This is a public university, and in contrast to many public universities in this country, our taxes pay for our education. So that means that I was paying just 1 cent, 1 penny actually, 1 penny per year. And if anyone will have more opportunities to give into the institution, you're allowed. Having said that, studied biology in La Facultad de Ciencias, which is sciences school. I focus on cell and molecular biology, looking into the biochemistry of some bacteria that help to fix nitrogen in some plants, especially in beans. And because of some health conditions, I'm not a traditional student. It took me longer. So in Mexico, we do a dissertation to get our bachelor's, and my dissertation was focused on creating a textbook for college students on biochemistry. Then I continued a little bit of my career going into philosophy for a year before going into a master's in biological sciences in a specific taxonomic and systematic biology, which is evolutionary biology, with a focus on science, technology, and society studies, or history and philosophy of science. And I did a stay in Johns Hopkins University in Baltimore. After that, I worked in Chiapas, collaborated in a documentary looking into something that I'm going to talk today about. I then when I relocated to the United States, I worked at the Field Museum in the Botany collection. I also created some culturally responsive STEM outreach groups in the Chicago area before relocating in 2014 to Seattle to start my doctorate degree. I focus on issues of food sovereignty and food justice, especially collaborating with Latinx communities in the Puget Sound area. I worked in the iSchool or information school. I worked for the Washington NASA Space Grant. And finally, I came into my current position about 2 years ago. So as you can see, not a linear path. I have to say my PhD was in environmental sciences, but I have done multiple things, moving from more traditional science, then mixing humanities, and then for my PhD, incorporating social sciences as part of my core disciplinary formation. But I want to ask you, what do you think it's nature? If I can ask you, like, defining one word or a couple of words, what's nature? Could you please think about what would you, or how you would define that that word? And for that, if you can please, and I'm on to hide. Oops, sorry about that. The text some of our students read. Oh my goodness. If you can start typing, someone says everything, you can use that QR if you're using your phone, or you can connect via your computer. Thank you, interconnectedness. Beautiful, everything, non-human, outside. I'll give maybe 20 more seconds for people to share. And you can share more than one word if you want. A gift and a responsibility. And I really value your input. And I'm receiving more and more, and I will share these with you. As you can see, this app, what it does is many people start sharing the same words, then they become a little bit bigger. So outside home, thank you so much for sharing that. I'll share again with all of you at the end of the class these word cloud. But going back into the presentation, so it's important to mention that our conceptions of nature depend on many factors. One is our self-identity or identity. Another one is as social beings, we depend on a context. So how we relate to others in our community. And by community, think not just in your family, think about your school, your neighborhood. Also maybe any disciplinary group, any religious group, all those are different forms of community. And then, of course, the geo-environmental identity. Where are we located in the globe? And for example, the different, as we call in science, ecosystems around us. And these, of course, can change with time and space. And actually, it's a dynamic conception. You will see that through your life, maybe the conception of nature will be changing. And again, this has to do not just with the context we live, but also with some other aspects. So we can think about internally as an individual, some of our characteristics. But as I mentioned, we are social beings, and then we are connected to the rest of the world and to the context in many different ways. You can think about your job level, maybe you can think about your parental status or your education, your geographic location, your work background. There are many things. This is what it's called intersectionality. That means that you are not just defined by one form of identity. You are all those multiple identities at the same time. and per moment, in each moment and in each context, you will be acting or assuming a positionality. That means that you might be in a professional setting, not sharing your religious beliefs, but you have a position in that professional setting. Think about your job title, that in relationship with a bigger context or society. And one important thing that I want to make sure I talk about is that race is a tricky concept. Here in the United States, is accepted as almost as a natural or inherent characteristic of people. However, again, this change in time and space, race is a social construct. And what do I mean by social construct? Well, this is something where humans, we are categorizing others and ourselves in groups depending on different characteristics. In the case of race, many times it's based on the color of skin, of the hair, of the eyes. Now in some genetic tests, you can say an haplotype, although the difference between races is really minimum. So that has proved that there's not necessarily something that it's called a race. And let me explain more about this. If we look into the taxonomy of us, the Homo sapiens, the smallest category we get is Homo sapiens. There's no Homo sapiens Caucasian. There's no Homo sapiens Latinx or Hispanic. There's no, so see, there's no further category that divides us. We are all Homo sapiens, and race is a social construct. Furthermore, that's why many Latinx and Hispanics, we don't define ourselves by race, but by ethnicity. That is our cultural context. And many of us, we are multiracial, and it's hard for us to define I'm 20% this or that. So it's important to keep this in mind, especially people can say, well, Isabel, okay, I understand that maybe in biology and in taxonomy, we're not recognizing race, but race exists, right? Well, not even in dogs. In dogs, we have subspecies, which will be a category further or smaller under species. And for example, for the domesticated dog, we have the Canis lupus familiaris, and all dogs from the Chihuahua to golden retriever, as in this image, all of them are one species, okay? Same with humans. We are all humans. Races are just social constructs, and please take this into account for this presentation. So now I want to talk about the biodiversity crisis, because as I was talking about, okay, is race something that happens naturally or is something that we construct socially? Well, the same happens with biodiversity. It's not something that scientists go into nature and discover biodiversity, okay? Biodiversity is a concept created in science as a way to describe what scientists were saying, to group what it's called the non-humans. And in academia, it has been linked to a phenomenon we are looking, and that it's not new, but in current times, it has been exponentially growing because of climate change and other environmental hazards, and that's the biodiversity crisis. In this sense, the biodiversity crisis is not a natural object. It's not something that occurs by itself, an object outside in nature. It's a discourse. A discourse created by academia, by politicians, by experts, by policymakers, by NGOs. It's a discourse. And unfortunately, the biodiversity crisis, because in academia, we know that is still a white predominant area, and I will say cis and male-dominated discipline or area. What we see is that part of this discourse is rooted in values that represent the people who are talking or building this discourse. Okay, so if we look into in the books and in the news, who is publishing about these, what it's called the biodiversity crisis? Think about their multiple identities, and you'll see many of them, even when they have great arguments, are white males. So this takes me into an important point. Science is an institution. Also, through that institution, we have ways of knowing, right? So in those ways of knowing, we set systems and standards. So as we were talking about classifications and how we classify, for example, what's in nature, and we can talk about species, and to be honest, there are 68 definitions of species. So tell me which one is the correct one, especially when you're investing millions of dollars in saving a species. So which definition are you using? But let's keep moving. Classifications system relies on standardized units that have been legitimized by authorities in an institutional or a system of institutions in an institutional setting. And these units or standards rely on concepts, and concepts rely on worldviews, and worldviews in education. So we tend to think that science is this objective area where we are just discovering facts and sharing information. Well, actually, science, it's not that objective. We are all human beings, all who we identify as scientists, we're all human beings. We are part of different communities. We are affected by those communities, and we affect those communities as well. And in that sense, science influences also political and moral values. And I'm thinking again into the case of species, or in the case of the discourse of biodiversity crisis. Think about the impacts that scientists or scientific arguments are having in political and moral arguments. And I'll have some examples to explain these further. Stacy, are there any questions?
Nope, not yet. You're good.
Perfect. Thank you. So in this sense, an ideal of order, like this idea of there's an order because there's a system and we have groups and there are categories, can lead to environmental, social, and epistemic injustices. And I'm going to talk a little bit more about this. So as I was mentioning, well, as scientists or humans, and we go through a process of education through which we learn to share those standards and concepts and sometimes values, okay? But if we think about education as more as a systemic component, and I'm thinking about K through 12 education. Well, around the world, there's now in vogue this concept about scientific literacy. That means that a common citizen is able to understand scientific concepts, use them properly in the daily life, and understand a scientific argument. Well, if that's the goal, because that's the goal for many of the standards, educational standards, that means those standards in which students are evaluated and all the courses are designed taking that scientific literacy. Well, we are having these standards, and that means that whoever sticks to those standards passes or fails. And this is really interesting because that allows them then students to continue into a pathway, in the educational pathway, and then go into higher education, and then go into STEM. So we can talk about systemic racism and structural inequities in education, and why a lot of students that self-identify as Black, Indigenous, or people of color, BIPOC as it's named, or maybe low-income students cannot successfully go through these pathways. Well, in part is because of the gap in opportunities, and that means the opportunities they are exposed to in comparison to peers who traditionally are Caucasian or have better income, or in many cases, English is the first language if we're talking about the United States, or maybe that go into a private school. So consider all of that. But if we consider again education at that foundational pathway that leads us into accepting standards and assuming that those standards are a reality, then we are having an initial problem, right? Because not everyone will be able to get into the STEM degrees or STEM sciences, or sorry, disciplines. Moreover, let's talk about systems that are usually taught in school, and something as simple as numbers. Why are we assuming that these symbols, in the way they are expressed in here, are the way to go, when for millennia there have been other civilizations with other numerical systems? However, this is the standardized system we use. And it's so standardized that it's also the base for the binary system that kind of it's the base for our technology. And then furthermore, the technology then it's imposing these standards, and through the use of technology, even if I'm in Mexico, I have to use these standards and these ways of thinking that come usually from the global north. So this is how a little bit of the standardization through education goes, standardization through technology and through society. And now I know that might be a little bit confusing, but I hope in the next slides I can connect those dots. So now, is the conservation or environmental movement a new form, and sorry, there's a M missing, of colonialism? Well, remember that numerical system, or that classification for a species? Indeed, it's a westernized, this white European rooted system to describe nature. For those who are interested in philosophy and history of science, there's a big amount of resources looking into how these systems and standards were set. But in the case of, for the context of conservation, we can think about the different ways in which scientists have been creating these natural objects, and I'm meaning natural in quotes, because in reality, what's happening is that they do not necessarily occur as scientists are stating, but for the matter of discourse and use of power, they create these natural objects or categories that then become standards, and then that shapes a little bit of the policies. So we can think about in the 1960s, when we went from concepts of a species, and we were counting how many species were going extinct, into later thinking, well, it's not enough with the rise of ecology. Well, now we have to talk about ecosystems and habitats, right? And then in the 90s, then we started thinking, okay, it's not just about the species and the ecosystems, it's also about humans and then the practices of natural resource management, for example. And then by the 2000s, we started thinking, okay, well, yes, we are getting that now it's not just nature for itself outside of humans, or nature despite people, but now it's nature for people. And this new approach where we have these ecosystem services and values, which at the end of the day, it's in function of human necessities. Again, when I'm referring to humans, we will have to think about who are we including in that category, right? And that led to areas as environmental economics. And then since 2010, we have heard about climate change, and now it's more interdisciplinary, but still we are seeing division between people and nature. And it's in the recent decade where there has been more push from climate and environmental justice leaders saying, hey, this is a westernized way to describe nature. I want to focus in one way that nature is described, which is the natural capital. And again, this was born around the 2000s. It leads into a lot of the policy or environmental policies done around the world. And defines, again, it's defined by this idea of biodiversity. So a concept that came from science. And it looks into these services and values that nature has in the service, again, of human beings and the value, therefore, they have. One can say, well, this is a really capitalist approach. Not all of us stick to it. However, if you have said, oh, I love the sustainable development goals, then in fact, you are also subscribing to the natural capital because it was introduced as part of the Sustainable Development Goals in Rio 20, which was a United Nations Conference on Sustainable Development. And again, this sticks to an idea of sustainability where we have, yes, this part of the ecosystems or ecology or nature, then people or society, and then a big important component is the economic component. By the way, the Natural Capital Coalition, which again, it's connected to the UN Sustainability Development Goals, which have great goals. I mean, many of them, I applaud them. As you can see in here, we have companies as Coca-Cola, or Cemex, or maybe Shell, Rocher, so Nestle. Like, yes, as you can see, it starts to getting murky because now it's not just about conserving that biodiversity and the nice development goals about let's end poverty, but really there are other interests behind it. So my advice is always try to be a critical thinker when adopting any or endorsing any position or movement. This takes me into what it's called the tensions global north and global south. This is something that in science we know a little bit, but it's more in political sciences and social sciences. This is nothing new. This division has been described since the 80s, where the global north is still those developed countries, which initially we can say in the 19th, 18th, and 19th century were those colonizers. And then you might find some little spots here and there, but again, part of those developed countries. And then the rest of the world, which is considered the global south, which is those developing countries. So in the global north, we have 25% of the global population. However, they concentrate or control 4/5 of the economy. So the global north is where the decisions around environmental policy are made. And usually those are exported into the global south. And this creates different tensions, but I want to talk more about this. And I want to go back into something that was taught in our reading and Stacy mentioned, the issue of representation. Why these countries, even if they are just 25% of the population, have to make the decisions for the rest of the world, the 75% of the rest of the population. Where is the rest represented in the decision making or in the science that sets the standards? So again, this is really linked into sustainable development, and I want to talk briefly about an incredible program called RED, which stands for Reducing Emissions for Deforestation and Forest Degradation. Of course, sustainable and development and sustainability comes with the idea of let's save the planet. Part of that is a biodiversity crisis, to be honest. And let's save the planet, it's let's go green. And if you look into even a carbon calculator, what it asks you is about consumerism, about how many bulbs there are in your house, if you have LED bulbs, if you have energy efficient electrodomestics. Well, that might be something that people, and not everyone in the global north can afford, but not everyone in the south can afford. Does that make the people in the global south the polluters? Well, the tension here comes even further, because what's happening is that RED is allowing the global north to say, I'm investing on, for example, carbon stocks. That means I will pay for projects in the global south to preserve jungles and forests. And that preservation, by the way, entails in many cases the relocation of indigenous groups. So they are evicted of their areas in order for these supporters of the RED projects to preserve those stocks of carbon, those trees. We're not thinking about maybe the connections and the livelihoods of those living in those territories. These are being evicted. And this is a clear example is in the state of California, and what's happening in what I was doing in Chiapas with the eviction of all indigenous communities from a core zone in Montes Azules. which is in the Lacandon jungle, right? Because we have this idea of natural protected areas that scientists have endorsed, and now it's had moved into policy arenas, and that allows this to happen. So RED is part of the UN. It's part of Sustainable Development Goals as one of the tools, and still is used as a tool to enact social injustices, especially from the global north into the global south. In fact, the global south, we are not allowed to become developed because first, we don't have the technology, but second, because there are environmental laws that say, well, you cannot become developed as the other ones who have been already developed by resource extraction, right? And furthermore, who owns the mines in many cases that are in our forest or our lands? Usually those are transnational companies. So going further into RED, I want just to make sure, yes, we all want a green economy. Yes, we want to save the planet if you want. We want to take climate action as part of the sustainability global sustainability development goals. But in fact, for many indigenous, not just in Mexico, but around the world, RED means genocide. RED is reducing emissions from deforestation and forest degradation. That's what UN says. But for these groups are reaping profits from evictions, land grab, deforestation, and destruction of biodiversity. Because one important thing to say is that human groups and nature have co-evolved. So by extracting these communities from natural areas, you are impacting biodiversity. The problem then that we are seeing is these technocratic regimes. That means these policy making guided by scientific topics, scientific concepts, scientific advisors in many cases. Because we are so centered into the data many times, we forget about things as sovereignty and self-determination, which is linked to recognition. The real needs and interests of local communities, because as good scientists, sometimes we are trained to think about solutions and then we just focus on the needs and we don't look into the interests of these communities. We then tend to generalize and do not recognize the difference between local and global scales. We sometimes undermine social cultural difference, for example, with the carbon calculator. We erase the historical role of local communities and indigenous communities in conservation. And we delegitimize the traditional knowledge. And this is an epistemic injustice. This has other consequences. And this is a little bit of what I was talking about, education. So we are displacing all these people, all these groups, we're keeping them aside. And then we expect the NGOs and academia to reflect a diversity that they haven't been able to even foster, to really value. So this is from Diversity Green, the Green 2.0 report. And you can see how many people of color are, at least in the United States and in NGOs that are like Ford and other big companies that do investments around the world. Foundations, look at the percentages of people of color, right? So this percentage also reflects who is not being represented and who is making the decisions in all these organizations, agencies, and foundations. And that's where we have to think about our privilege, because it's not just white privilege, but white privilege in these cases, it's there, and it's something that we have to be able to discuss. And when we talk, people of color, we talk about breaking this green ceiling. The fact that there's no more than 60% of BIPOC individuals in these structural or institutions, structural entities or institutions. This is just to give you another idea from the past report from ASHE. Sorry, you might not see the numbers, but you can see this will be 2020, 2017, actually 2020, 2017, and 2015. You can see again that and this is in higher education, so anyone working in Office of Sustainability in higher education will be represented in here. And you can see as well the overrepresentation of white people. So this speaks a lot. Another problem that I want to quickly mention is with a technocratic approach, we sometimes assume that the idea that nature is outside of me and culture, that's for social scientists, and as a natural scientist, I should just focus on that in nature. Well, actually, that's a false dichotomy, because culture and nature are intertwined, because we co-evolve with nature, and nature shapes us as well. And then the sense of connectedness to nature will be linked to that sense of intersectionality and positionality that we comment. Also, it takes two false assumptions and biases. For example, because many Latinx here in the United States might not have the right to vote, that doesn't mean that we do not have pro-environmental behaviors. Or maybe because we cannot have LED bulbs, or again, efficient electrodomestics at home, that doesn't make us more pollutants. In fact, there are many surveys that show that Latinx individuals have or show stronger pro-environmental behaviors. And there are many, many organizations across this country that speak about that at the root level, not at the scientist level, not at the elitist level, but at the street level. So just before opening for questions, you will think, well, okay, well, seems pretty bad. What can we do? Well, there are no easy solutions, but becoming aware of these topics and being able to discuss them openly, it's a first step. But we have to recognize the legacy of colonialism and imperialism that scientists and science has. That is also recognizing the socio-historical and sociocultural roots of science, the political power that science has in our days, and think that, as Rebecca Solnit says, everything is political. Thinking that we can be apolitical is then an endorsement for a status quo. So if you want to make a change, start with yourself and educating yourself and connecting to others, but do something. Not just assume that because you are doing science, that's all that you can do. Just a couple more slides. Think about the global knowledge production. Where are the main journals where we can publish? That also determines what science is saying. And you can see that the Global South is not really well represented in there. So again, who is being represented in that published science? And finally, reflect on your own position. Yes, recognize biases in you and in academia. Reflect on your position when you are in your lab, when you're in your school, and when you're interacting with communities outside of academia. Be open-minded and try to educate yourself on these topics. Travel to learn, not travel as just as a way of enjoying, but also to educate yourself. That will lead you to look into other worldviews. Join in solidarity to groups working to dismantle structural inequities. Amplify the voices who have been silenced by academia, science, and have been oppressed by centuries. And if you want to do something and you want to interact with communities, do meaningful engagement and not just use communities to extract data. So those are kind of my suggestions, my perspectives. A little bit longer than expected, but hopefully it was good.
Yeah, thank you very much, Isabel. We enjoyed that a lot. There is clapping going on for you. So with that, we'll take one or two questions from the YouTube chat. I will also start off with one. So if people want to take some time to type, I can check out the chat as you're going. So just to sort of start, I think this question a lot, and I know a lot of the students enrolled in the class are also sort of struggling with this concept of, you feel like a small fish in a big pond when it comes to trying to change the way you're doing research and the way your research is going to connect to communities. So what are some suggestions you have for sort of trying to change these dynamics when you're not a principal investigator, or if you're not in charge of your own research program? Oh, wait, you're
sorry. Yeah, no, if you can initially educate yourself about what other forms are there, right? What other methodologies are there? That's a good way to start. And then organize yourself. So maybe in your lab, you might not have power, but that doesn't mean that you are just a scientist in your lab. You're a scientist in an institution. You can connect to other students. You can work and collaborate with other scientists outside of your lab. So think about that. Bring to your lab these kind of conversations and suggest to your advisors, mentors, or the directors in your labs to have open conversations about these topics. That could be just a first step.
Awesome. That's a great suggestion. Thank you. We have a question in the chat, which is, thinking about RED and other forms of carbon credits, are there policies or initiatives that you are aware of that empower local communities and resist their exploitation?
Well, yes, they are rooted in local communities, and there are a lot of cooperatives, for example. And I can speak for Mexico, but I know that there are in Indonesia and in other countries where really it's people coming together and doing their own markets. Okay, so they are determining the rules, the standards, how they are going to manage their resources, who, how, when they are accessing to the money. And that's a movement also across the states. In several tribal communities, they are doing that as well, not just with forest, for example, and timber. And I'm thinking about the Colville. They are doing some work on that, not necessarily at a market, a global market scale, but yes, they are starting to do that. And there are other tribal communities doing and moving into other natural resources. Awesome.
Thank you so much for that answer. I might cut it off at this point so we actually have time to chat amongst the students one-on-one with Isabel, but I want to take the opportunity to say thank you so much for speaking with us today. If anybody who's watching has any further questions they want to ask, you should feel free to email Isabel or myself. You can find details for that on the class website, which is in the video linked in the description of this. And yeah, thank you so much again. And thank you all for watching. And yeah, we look forward to seeing you all next week, hopefully.